Hi and welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to talk about core animations and how to use core animation for interesting animations, and this is what we're going to create, this nice 3D animated carousel that you can actually use interactively with a pan gesture recognizer. I've just used this video here to illustrate that it really runs smoothly, since when you're going to test things like core animation in the simulator, it isn't that smooth due to the missing hardware acceleration, but be sure that this is an amazing framework. Apple uses it throughout UIKit. And if you haven't noticed, the reason why you're getting this tutorial right now is because I've asked your opinion on whether you'd like to see animations with core animation now or server-side Swift code with Vapor. And many people have used this poll option here in the community tab, and you're going to be notified if I'm going to do this in the future. So it's a great idea to subscribe to this channel. And to conclude this year, I'd like to thank you for your ongoing support with a little giveaway. You have the chance to win 10 times my newest 2 courses, from design to code and 2D games with SpriteKit. They have a combined value of almost $400, and you can learn everything from creating a design in Sketch, translating that into a real application with cool effects, cool transition effects, and also build a real game from start to finish using SpriteKit. So if you want to win one of 10 times this bundle, then be sure to subscribe to this channel and also write a comment under this video and telling me why you'd like to win this course bundle, and you have the chance to take part in this giveaway until January 1st, 2019. And now, without further ado, let's get started with our carousel. So to get started, just create a single view application. I did the same thing right here. There are just a few modifications that I've done. For example, changing the background color of my view controller's view. I've added a few pictures here directly into my project. You could, of course, download images from the internet in your application, or also add images right here to your project, whatever you like. We're just going to need some pictures for this project. And in my view controller, I've also added a little bit of code already. For example, a very tiny helper function that does nothing else but to convert a degree angle into an angle in radians. This is pretty much a standard formula for this conversion, so I'm sure you're already familiar with that. And since I've chosen a dark background color, I've also overwritten here my preferred status bar style for this view controller to just return a light content so that the status bar is white. And now in View.load, I've also added a pan gesture recognizer that we are going to use for the carousel turn animation, and I've added this gesture recognizer to my view and associated that with a simple perform pan action function. So absolutely nothing fancy here. So first of all, we want to work now with core animation and core animation layers. And therefore, what we are going to do is right above our perform pan action function, I'm going to add a new function called add image card. This is going to receive a name as a string, and we're not going to return anything here. So this is our simple function just with this name parameter that we're going to use for our image names. And as you can see, I have done something very convenient right here. I've just named my images 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 so that I can initialize them with the index of a for loop in a second. But before we do that, let's just see what we can do with core animation and core animation layers. So first of all, I'm going to create an an image layer. And this is all very familiar if you've ever worked with a view, but slightly different. And I'm going to show you how it's different in a second. So if we want to create a core animation layer, all we need to do is initialize that with CA layer. And now we can just access standard properties like, for example, a frame. And for our purposes, we're going to use CGRect, initialize that with X, Y, and width and height. Now, for the positioning of our image cards, what I'd like to do is actually position them in the center. So for the X value, I'm going to go with the view, its frame, its size, and its width, and just divide that by 2, and then subtract the size of our image. And therefore, to have it a little more convenient, let's just create an image card size constant right above our image layer. And this is going to be a CG size. And what I'd like to have here is a width of 200 and a height of 300. And this, I think, is just very well suited for our purpose. And now what we can do is subtract simply the image card size and its width, divide that by 2, and with that we have our image layer centered in X direction or centered horizontally. And now let's do the same thing for the height. So again, view, frame, size, height, divide that by 2, and now subtract the image card size and the height, also just half of it. And for the width and height, we just have our image card size, the width, and the image card size and height. And as you can see, there is nothing different here to in comparison to actually setting the frame of a view. And just correcting here what I've misspelled, so just adding an H here and that should do it. And now we have just initialized our frame. And as you can see, it's really the same thing as with any other view. And since we're here, let's also define an anchor point for our image layer, just setting that to a CG point of 0.5 and 0.5, so really nothing fancy here. And now let's have a look at the actual cool stuff, or actually how to add an image to a image layer. We don't have an image view right here. There is no UI image view in CA layer, but it is very simple to actually add an image to our layer. And before we can do that, what we have to do is make sure that we have an image. So I'm going to add a guard let statement right here to check if we really get our image, because if we don't get an image, there is no real sense in moving on. So I'm initializing my constant here with UI image, initialize that with a name, and we have our name here as a parameter, so just passing that along. And now what we have to do here, since we're using actually Quad's core here together with CA layer, we also need to use a CG image. So this is all you have to remember. For example, in dealing with images, you have to convert your images to a CG image, and the same thing applies to colors. For example, if you have a UI color object, you have to convert that to a CG color object, which is very simple, as you're going to see in a second. But if this does not work here, if we cannot get an image with the name we have specified, then we cannot continue, and we're just returning from this function. But we're now pretty much sure that we have our image, and we can now use our image layer and access the contents property. And this is actually where we have to put our image. And here we can simply add our image card image. And now, if we're going to run this right now, we wouldn't see anything because we haven't added or called the add image card function, but our image might be distorted. Just as you know, if you're dealing with a UI image, there is something like a content mode, and the content mode of a UI image is pretty much the same as the content's gravity in core animation. So to actually get a satisfying result, what we're going to do is set this to resize aspect fill, which does actually what you would expect if you're familiar with the content mode of a UI image view. Also, what we have here for the image layer is masks to bounds to cut off the rest of the image that we actually do not want to see. And since we're here and since we are doing these configurations, what I'd also like to do is use my image layer and set it to is double-sided and set this to true. Because if we wouldn't do that in 3D, we actually wouldn't see anything if we're having a look at the back of our layer, because then only the front would display our content. And with that, we're making sure that the content is displayed on both sides of our layer. And to see if this works, let's now, right before the initialization and the declaration of our pan gesture recognizer in view.load, let's add an image with name, let's just say 1. And of course, before we can see anything, we should also add our layer to our view, or to the view's layer hierarchy. So what we are going to do is use our view of our view controller in our add image card function right at the bottom and access the layer property and add a sublayer, which is going to be our image layer. Now let's run this in the simulator and see if we were indeed successful. And there we are. We have our image in our view controller, and this is nothing fancy actually, but you're going to see how cool this is going to be and what possibilities we have with our layer. Because what we can do now here with our image layer is to do some slight configurations. For example, let's do that maybe right below the image layer is double-sided configuration, and what we can do is use our image layer and add a border color, for example, for a border. And now, as I've told you, when we're using UI color, and I want this to be white actually, so let's set white to 1 and give this a slight alpha channel or opacity of just 50%. And now we immediately get this warning here, or this error, that we cannot assign a UI color to type of CG color, but luckily we just have to call CG color to actually convert this UI color to a CG color. Now, what I'd also like is, of course, to give this image layer a border width. So I'm going to go with 5 here. And now another cool thing is that we can also change the corner radius of a CA layer. And I'm just going to set this to, let's say, 10. And now let's just have a look at this in the simulator again and see how this looks. And I think it's going to look pretty cool already. And indeed, it does. We have this nice image card, and now we can focus on actually generating more image cards and also make this 3-dimensional and animatable. So therefore, what we are going to do is actually adding a few more properties to our view controller class right above the preferred status bar style property. And first of all, what we need is a transform layer, which is going to be a CA transform layer. I'm just going to initialize that right here, and this is going to be the container for all of our image cards. Then, since we want to rotate our image cards, we're going to create a variable here, a current angle, which is going to be a CG float. We initialize that with 0, and we're going to have a current offset, also a CG float, which is going to store the offset of our pan gesture recognizer. And these are all the properties that we're going to need. But what we should also do now in view.load is initialize our transform layer, or give our transform layer a little bit of more information. So right above our add image card call that we've already added to our view.load function, what I'd like to do is set our transform layers frame to self view and bounds to actually give the size of our screen. And then what I'd also like to do is, instead of adding all of our images to our view controller's view, we're going to use the view controller's view, its layers, and add our transform layer as a sublayer here, and then add all of our image cards to this transform layer so that we can make changes to all of our image cards at once. So here we're not going to use view.layer, but transform layer and add our image layer as a sub layer. And I say layer way too much in this video, but let's just move on and see what we have to do in order to get more than just one image. So we have added our transform layer now to our views layer hierarchy, and we are now going to create a simple for loop to call our add image card function. So since I'm going to have 6 images and I need an index to initialize my image cards, I'm going to use a for loop with an index variable of I and just iterate from 1 to 6. And then we're going to just call add image card and use string interpolation right here to pass along the image name as a string. And with that, we're calling our add image card function just as many times as we have images in our assets folder. You could do that differently depending on your situation, but for now, for these demo purposes, this is just going to be enough. But now, if we run our application, I'm just going to do that, you will see that all of our layers are actually sitting on top of each other. So we have a different picture right here, but of course, we cannot see every layer, and they're definitely not in 3D or in a carousel. But therefore, we're going to add a new function right now. Let's just do that right above the pan gesture recognizer, and I'm just going to call that turn the carousel. And this is the function that we're using to actually turn our images and also to give it an initial value, or give our images, our image layers, their initial values and their initial position. And before we can actually continue, we need to make sure that we have our sublayers, our transform sublayers from our transform layers, so that we definitely know how many images we're going to work with. So since there could be an optional, or there is an optional here for the sublayers of our transform layer, and of course these sublayers are our image cards, I'm going to use a guard let statement here for the transform sublayers. And I'm going to have a transform layer here, and this is our property, and as you can see, the sublayers array is an optional, and we need to make sure that we get this value, and if we do not get it, we'd have to return. So this is our first step. Now the second step is to actually define the size of each, or the size of each image card segment that we need to actually create a circle. And therefore, what we need to do is create another constant here, segment for image card is what I'm going to call that. And to get the segment size as an angle, what we are going to do is use a full circle, so 360 degrees, and just divide that by our transform layer sublayers array, and we're going to count that. But we cannot really work with this property because we're going to need CG floats, so let's simply cast that to a CG float right there, and add some parentheses, and we're done with the calculation for each segment. Now, what we're also going to need is an angle offset. So we're going to initialize that, or we already have the current angle set to 0. I'm going to call that variable here. Angle offset, set it to our current angle. The current angle is what we have stored as our global property in view controller, and this is going to change when we're panning through our carousel. And now what we need to do is actually iterating through each of our sublayers, so through each of our image cards to give them their correct position. So what I'm going to do now is creating a for loop for each layer in our transform sublayers array. We're going to use or create a new transform matrix, or a 4x4 matrix, which we're using since we're working in 3D space. So this is going to be a transform transform, and we initialize that with CA transform 3D identity. And this gives us indeed a 4x4 matrix that we can work with. And there are actually, there is one very important element in this matrix for us. And this is in the third row and in the fourth column of our 4x4 matrix. So we're accessing that by using our transform variable and using just M34. So M34, which is responsible for the depth of our perspective. There is some interesting and also complex math behind that, and this is also very interesting, but too much for this tutorial. If you'd like to learn more about 3D space and matrices, then let me know in the comments below, and I'm going to create a video specifically for that stuff. But for now, let's just keep in mind that this element in our matrix is responsible for the depth of our perspective. And what we can assign here is a very small value. I'm going to use a negative value here. You could also use a positive value, but this affects the sign that you have to use for your angles later on, so that I can use positive values later. I'm going to use a negative value right here. And as you can see, this is a very small value, 1 divided by 500. And the closer this value gets to 0, the deeper our perspective gets. And we're going to just use this value for now. You can experiment with that if you like. And now, since we've set this perspective value, we can perform matrix operations without having to calculate anything. So therefore, we now first of all perform a rotation on our matrix and on the matrix's identity. So let's now just use our transform matrix, and then what we can do is use CA core animation transform 3D, and now we can, for example, access the helper rotate. And first of all, we have to rotate a specific transform, so we're passing along our transform by a specific angle. And this angle now needs to be provided in radians and not in degree, and therefore we have our degree to radians function. And what I'd like to pass along here is our angle offset that we've already defined here as a variable, and we've also a current angle that we're going to update later on. And now we have to define around which axis we actually want to rotate. So first of all, we do not want to rotate around the x-axis, but around the y-axis. So we're setting this to 1, and also the z-axis, we set this to 0. All right, so this is what we've done now for the rotation on the matrix identity. And now what we also need to do is we need to translate our image card. Therefore, we're just adding yet another transform operation, which is going to be a CA transform 3D and now translate. And again, we have to specify our matrix here, and then we can decide along which axis, again, we want to translate. So we do not want to use the x-axis, we do not want to use the y-axis, but in this case, we want to use the z-axis and just translate by about 200. So what we do here is we use the identity, and then we rotate, and then we also translate our images. And this is actually all we need to do for now. What we also have to do, of course, is use our layer and assign our transform value or our transform matrix to the layer's transform. And the interesting thing about core animation is that when you change properties of a layer, the animations take place automatically over a default time. Since we want to animate our carousel by the speed of our pan gesture, we have to deactivate that. Therefore, I'm using the CA trans action and set the animation duration to just 0, just to do not get the standard animations. And the last thing we need to do is to actually use our angle offset and increment that or add for our segment for the image card so that we definitely the correct angle for each of the image cards and in each iteration through our for loop. So this is the first aspect of our turn carousel animation, because we do not yet update it with the correct values from our pan gesture recognizer. But what we can do already is to call our turn carousel function in view.load after we have created all of our image cards. And now I can just run this in the simulator, and we should see our image cards arranged in some kind of a circle. And indeed, we can see the depth. We can see our first image, and we can also see some other images. But now we have to actually do some more work in our perform pan action function. This isn't too hard, actually. We just need to update all the values correctly. And the first thing that we need to get is the translation of our finger position in our view. And we are actually only interested in the X direction. So for the offset of our translation, what we are going to do is use our recognizer that we have as a parameter right here, access the translation in self.view, of course, and just get the X value right here. And this should actually be a CG float, which it is indeed. And with that, we have the X offset that we can work with. And then what we can do with this offset is create another variable or constant that I'm going to call X difference, because this is the distance that we're going to cover, or that we have covered since the last gesture event that took place. So here I'm just going to use the X offset and subtract the current offset. And with that global property that we have, we're generating always the distance that we've covered with our finger. But now we also need to change and update the current offset. So what I'm going to do is use the current offset and add the X difference. And what I'd also like to do is use our current angle and also add the X difference to also update this value. And then last but not least, we can call our turn carousel function to be updated each time each time this perform pan action function is called by the pan gesture recognizer. And with that, we're updating all of the values continuously while there's movement of a finger on the screen. And now the last thing that I'd like to do is actually add a little if statement right below our X offset definition. Here, what I like to do is using our recognizer and its state and check for the begin state, because each time we begin a new gesture recognition, or the user has lifted the finger and now begins with a new action on the screen, I just want to reset the current offset to 0. So every time a new gesture begins, we reset this offset value. And actually with that done, we can try this whole thing out and see if we can actually move our carousel. And as you remember, this doesn't really look too smooth on the simulator, but I think we get the idea, and we have this nice little animation here moving our carousel. And I think that is a really, really cool effect. And we've done this with so few lines of code, just using core animation. I think you can see what power lies in this framework and why Apple uses it throughout UIKit. There's just one more tiny thing that I'd like to change to conclude our tutorial for today, which is changing the speed of our animation, or the speed that we are passing along to our animation, which we can control with our difference variable here, or the difference constant, because as you can see, it goes through these images We're going through them really fast here on the simulator, and this should be a little worse on the simulator. So if you're testing this on a real device, you will see the difference. So I'm just going to go maybe about 0.6 here, multiply that with 0.6, our offset, to just slow everything a little bit more down to enjoy the animation or the carousel a bit more on a real device and to get closer to what you've seen earlier in the introduction. So this really now concludes our core animation tutorial for today. This is also the last tutorial for this year. I thank you so much for your support that you've shown in 2018. If you want to win these 2 great courses for free, be sure to subscribe to this channel and write a comment below on why you would like to have these courses for free. Thank you so much again. Take care, and we'll see each other next year.